March 7th, 1945. The Rhine River. For centuries, this dark ribbon of water had served as Germany's final natural fortress. Hitler himself had declared it. The Rhine will be our moat. No Allied soldier will cross it alive. But on this cold morning, as fog rolled across the water like ghostly fingers, 9 American soldiers stood at the western edge of the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen. Behind them, the entire weight of the Allied advance. Before them, across 1,000 feet of steel and concrete, an entire German battalion was forming up for a desperate counterattack. The bridge shouldn't have even been standing. Every other crossing for 200 miles had been destroyed by retreating Wehrmacht forces. Yet here it was damaged, rigged with explosives that had failed to detonate, swaying precariously over the churning river below. And 9 men were about to make a choice that would change the course of the war. Sergeant Alex Drabick pressed his back against the cold steel of the bridge tower, his breath coming in short bursts. At 26, he'd seen more death than most men would in 3 lifetimes. Normandy, the Bulge, the frozen forests of the Ardennes where he'd watched friends disappear into snowdrifts, their screams swallowed by artillery fire. But nothing had prepared him for this. "Sarge," whispered Private Jim Burrows, his hands shaking so violently he could barely hold his rifle. "We can't hold this. There's Jesus Christ, there's at least 200 of them forming up on the other side." Drabick knew. Through his binoculars, he'd counted them. German infantry, backed by panzers, machine gun nests being established in the buildings of Erpel on the eastern bank. Engineers working frantically to repair demolition charges that had only partially detonated hours earlier. The math was simple and terrifying. 9 against 200, maybe more. Lieutenant Karl Timmerman, their commanding officer, had given them their orders before racing back to coordinate reinforcements. Hold that bridge, no matter what. If it falls, or if the Germans retake it, thousands of our boys will die trying to cross elsewhere. You hold it until relief arrives. "When's relief coming?" someone had asked. Timmerman's silence had been answer enough. "Let me tell you about these 9 men. Because they weren't superheroes. They were farm boys and factory workers, letter carriers and shop clerks who'd been drafted into the machinery of war. Sergeant Drabick had left behind a pregnant wife in Ohio. He carried her photograph in his helmet, wrapped in wax paper to keep it dry. In his last letter home, written just 2 days before, he'd promised her, "I'll be careful. This war's almost over." Private Burrows, just 19, had lied about his age to enlist after his older brother was killed at Anzio. His mother didn't even know he was in combat. She thought he was still in training. Corporal Joseph DeLizio, a former Golden Gloves boxer from Brooklyn, who'd knocked out a German officer in hand-to-hand combat during the Hurtgen Forest and still had nightmares about the man's face. Private First Class Marion Priester, who'd been a divinity student before the war and now whispered prayers under his breath between bursts of machine gun fire. These were the men at the bridge. Exhausted, low on ammunition, separated from their main force by 200 yards of open ground that German 88 seconds had already zeroed in on. And they were terrified. At 0847 hours, the first German probe came. A squad of 12 Wehrmacht soldiers, moving fast and low across the bridge's eastern approach. They weren't expecting resistance. Intelligence had told them the Americans were still consolidating on the western bank. They were wrong. "Contact!" Drabick shouted, and the morning exploded into chaos. The Americans had positioned themselves in a defensive semicircle using damaged bridge supports, blown-out vehicles, and debris from the failed demolition. It wasn't much, but it was something. DeLizio's BAR, the Browning automatic rifle, roared first, a stuttering thunder that echoed off the stone towers. 3 Germans fell in the first burst. The others scattered, seeking cover behind the bridge's metal railings. "Conserve ammo," Drabick screamed over the gunfire. "Make every shot count." But even as he said it, he was doing the math in his head. They had maybe 200 rounds per man against a battalion. The equation didn't work. A German stick grenade arced through the air, trailing its distinctive wooden handle. It clattered against the bridge surface, spinning. Grenade! The explosion lifted Burroughs off his feet and slammed him into a concrete support. Blood streamed from his nose, his ears ringing so loudly he couldn't hear his own screaming. But he was alive. The German squad retreated, dragging their wounded. But Drabick knew what he'd just seen. That wasn't an attack. That was a probe. They were testing the American defenses, figuring out how many men, how much firepower. Now they knew the truth. Almost none. "We're dead," Burroughs said flatly, wiping blood from his face. "We're fucking dead, Sarge." Priester was praying again, louder now. "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death." "Shut up with that!" someone snapped. But Drabick wasn't listening to any of them. He was staring across the bridge at the German positions, his mind working through possibilities, angles, desperate gambles. The bridge was 1,069 feet long. The Germans controlled the eastern end. The Americans controlled the western end. In between was a killing ground of twisted metal, unexploded ordnance, and structural damage that made every step a potential death sentence. And here was the thing they discovered. The secret that might keep them alive. The Germans were terrified of the bridge collapsing. The failed demolition had left it structurally unsound. The Wehrmacht had standing orders not to use heavy weapons on the bridge itself. They needed it intact for their own counteroffensive. No panzers would cross it. No heavy artillery would target it directly. It was damaged enough to be dangerous, but still standing enough to be valuable. "Listen to me," Drabick said, his voice cutting through the panic. "They need this bridge as much as we do. Maybe more. That means they'll come at us with infantry only. No tanks. No big guns. Just men." "There's still 200 of them," Burroughs protested. "Yeah," Drabick acknowledged. "But they have to come to us across 300 yards of open bridge, and we're dug in." He looked at each of them, these terrified boys, with old men's eyes. "We make them pay for every foot. We make them think we're a company, not a squad. We keep moving positions so they can't get a count on us, and we hold until reinforcements arrive." "And if they don't arrive?" Delizio asked quietly. Drabick checked his rifle, chambered around. "Then we make them remember us." At 0920 hours, the German battalion began their assault in earnest. Through the lifting fog, Drabick watched them come. Not 12 men this time. 50. 100. More. Gray uniforms moving like a tide across the eastern bank. Officers shouting orders, machine guns being positioned, mortars being set up just out of range. This wasn't a probe. This was the real thing. Beside him, Burroughs chambered around with hands that had finally stopped shaking. Delizio kissed his crucifix and tucked it back under his uniform. Priester finished his prayer. "Here they come," someone whispered. The first wave hit the bridge at a run, boots thundering on metal and concrete. Rifles cracked. Men screamed. The air filled with the distinctive crack, crack, crack of Mauser fire, and the deeper boom of American Garans answering back. And 9 men, 9 ordinary men, began fighting for their lives against impossible odds. What happened in the next 6 hours would be studied at military academies for decades. It would inspire books, documentaries, debates among historians. But in that moment, there were no grand strategies, no brilliant tactics, just 9 Americans, a bridge, and a choice. Stand or die. They chose to stand. The first wave hit them like a hammer. 50 German soldiers, maybe more, spreading across the bridge in a textbook infantry assault. They moved in bounds, one group firing while another advanced, using the bridge's damaged supports and blown vehicles for cover. It should have overwhelmed 9 men in seconds. But Drabick had a plan. "Now!" he screamed. All 9 Americans opened fire simultaneously from their positions scattered across a 40-yard stretch of the bridge's western end. The sound was deafening, a wall of gunfire that echoed off the stone towers and rolled across the river like thunder. Germans fell. Others dove for cover. Officers shouted contradictory orders. The advance stalled. "Move," Drabick commanded. "Positions 2." Go! This was the trick. The deception that would save their lives. The 9 soldiers had pre-positioned themselves at multiple locations across the bridge's defensive perimeter. After firing from one position, they would sprint, staying low, staying fast, to completely different firing positions 20 or 30 yards away. From across the bridge, through the smoke and chaos, it looked like there were dozens of defenders, maybe more. Burrows fired 3 quick shots from behind a burned-out German truck, then scrambled on his hands and knees to a pile of rubble 25 yards north. 7 seconds later, he was firing again from a completely different angle. Delisio's BAR roared from the left flank, then fell silent. 15 seconds later, it opened up again from the right side of the bridge. The Germans couldn't get an accurate count. Every time they thought they'd located a defender, gunfire erupted from somewhere else entirely. "How many are there?" a German lieutenant screamed at his sergeant. "I don't know. 20, 30, they're everywhere." The first assault broke. The Germans fell back, dragging their wounded, leaving 7 dead on the blood-slicked bridge surface. Drabic allowed himself one breath of relief. Just one. Then he checked his ammunition. 18 rounds left in his rifle. Maybe 60 more in his belt. They'd just fired almost half their ammunition, stopping one attack. And the Germans were already regrouping for the next one. The second assault came 20 minutes later. Larger, more coordinated. But this time, the Americans had prepared something special. Something that would haunt German soldiers in their nightmares for years after. Priester had found them while scrounging through damaged supply crates a dozen smoke grenades left behind during the initial bridge capture. "Can you use these?" he'd asked Drabic. The sergeant's eyes had lit up. Oh yes. As the Germans advanced, the Americans didn't just shoot. They created hell itself. Smoke grenades detonated across the bridge, billowing thick white and yellow clouds that reduced visibility to 5 feet. In that artificial fog, the 9 Americans became ghosts. A German soldier would see a muzzle flash to his left. He'd turn, fire. Nothing there. Then gunfire would erupt behind him. He'd spin. Still, nothing. Just smoke and shadows and the screams of dying men. Delisio, that Brooklyn boxer, did something that would become legend among the survivors. He'd found a German helmet during the first assault. Now, in the smoke, he put it on and started shouting orders in broken German phrases he'd picked up from prisoners. Links, links, left, left. German soldiers, disoriented in the smoke, turned left directly into Burrows' line of fire. Zurück, zurück. Fall back. A German squad retreated in confusion, colliding with soldiers advancing behind them. The psychological effect was devastating. The Germans began to believe they were fighting a much larger, more sophisticated force. Special troops. Rangers, maybe. Commandos. Not 9 terrified kids from Ohio and Brooklyn and Kansas. The second assault collapsed into chaos. More Germans fell. More retreated. But the Americans were paying a price too. Private Michael Chinchar took a round through the shoulder. The bullet punched through his uniform and exploded out his back, spinning him around and slamming him into the bridge surface. "Medic!" someone screamed, then realized there was no medic. There was just them. Priester, the divinity student, crawled through gunfire to reach Chinchar. His hands, which once turned pages of scripture, now packed a sucking chest wound with torn cloth and prayer. "Am I dying?" Chinchar gasped, blood bubbling on his lips. "Not today, brother," Priester whispered. "Not on my watch." He kept Chinchar alive with nothing but pressure bandages made from torn shirts and sheer willpower. It was a miracle. Or maybe it was just what happens when ordinary men are pushed beyond their limits and refuse to break. By 1100 hours, the Germans had made 4 assault attempts. 4 times they'd been thrown back. But the cost was mounting. The Americans were down to fewer than 30 rounds per man. Chinchar was badly wounded. Burns had taken shrapnel in his leg and could barely walk. Delisio's BAR had jammed twice, and he was nursing it along like a dying friend. Worse, the Germans were getting smarter. Through his binoculars, Drabic watched them setting up mortars on the eastern bank. out of range of American small arms fire, but easily able to drop shells onto the bridge defenders. Once those mortars opened up, it was over. There was no cover on the bridge that would stop an 81mm mortar round. "Sarge," Delisio said quietly, "we need to talk about what happens when we run out of ammo." Drabic knew what he was really asking. When do we surrender? When do we run? The sergeant looked at his 8 remaining effectives. Bloodied, exhausted, down to their last rounds. Any reasonable commander would have pulled back, would have saved his men to fight another day. But the bridge, the damned bridge. If they lost it, the Germans would blow it for sure this time. The Rhine crossing would be gone. Thousands of American soldiers would die at other crossing points. The war would drag on for months. All because 9 men couldn't hold for a few more hours. "We're not surrendering," Drabic said. "And we're not running." "Then what?" Burroughs asked. Drabic smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. It was the smile of a man who'd been pushed past fear into something colder and harder. "We make them think we have more bullets than we do." What happened next would be talked about in hushed tones by military historians. Some would call it genius. Others would call it insanity. Drabic called it survival. He positioned his men in a single line across the western bridge entrance, completely exposed, completely visible. "You want us to just stand here?" Burroughs asked, incredulous. "Trust me." As the 5th German assault formed up, Drabic walked to the center of the bridge, alone, in full view of the enemy. He raised his rifle above his head. For a moment, the entire battlefield went silent. Germans stopped advancing, confused. Was this a surrender? Then Drabic fired a single shot into the air, and all 8 of his remaining men opened fire every weapon they had. Every remaining round a thunderous barrage that lasted 15 seconds. Then silence. Drabic stood there, arms crossed, staring down the German battalion. The message was clear. We have ammunition to spare. We're so confident we'll waste it just to prove a point. Come at us and we'll cut you down. It was a bluff, a desperate, insane bluff. They'd just fired almost everything they had left. But the Germans didn't know that. The 5th assault never came. Across the bridge, the German commander lowered his binoculars. These Americans were either heavily reinforced or completely insane. Either way, a frontal assault wasn't working. He would have to try something else. At 1,145 hours, as Drabic was trying to figure out how to fight a battle with 8 rounds remaining, salvation arrived from an unexpected direction. Not reinforcements, something better. A young American engineer, Sergeant Eugene Dorland, came sprinting across the open ground from the western bank. Bullets kicked up concrete dust around his feet, but he was laughing, actually laughing, as he slid into cover beside Drabic. "What the hell are you doing here?" Drabic demanded. Dorland grinned and pointed back toward the western bank, where a Sherman tank was carefully, slowly, beginning to nose its way onto the bridge. "Colonel says the bridge can maybe handle 1 tank. Maybe. He's sending it across." "1 tank?" Burroughs said. "Against a whole battalion?" "1 tank," Dorland confirmed. "But here's the thing the Germans don't know. It's just 1. Drabic understood immediately. If 1 tank could make it across, the Germans would have to assume more could follow. They'd have to prepare for an armored assault, which meant pulling back, regrouping, which meant time. The Sherman crept onto the bridge, every rivet groaning, metal shrieking. The entire structure swayed. For a horrible moment, Drabic thought the whole thing would collapse, sending them all into the Rhine. But it held. The tank commander, a lieutenant named Phillips, rotated his turret toward the German positions and fired 1 round. Just 1. The shell screamed across the bridge and detonated among the German assembly area. Men scattered. Officers shouted. Panic rippled through their ranks. And behind that single tank, moving fast and low, came 30 American infantry soldiers, real reinforcements. The 9 had held long enough. As fresh troops took over the defensive positions, Drabic sat down heavily on the bridge surface. His hands were shaking now, the adrenaline finally draining away. Delizio dropped down beside him. "We did it. Jesus Christ, Sarge. We actually did it." "We're not done yet," Drabic said. But he allowed himself a small smile. Across the bridge, the Germans were pulling back, consolidating. They'd try again, that was certain. But now they'd be facing a reinforced company, not 9 desperate men. Burroughs limped over, his leg bandaged, and sat down without a word. Then Priester. Then the others. The 8 who could still walk. They didn't say much. There wasn't much to say. They'd done something impossible. Something they'd later struggle to explain to people who hadn't been there. For 6 hours, 9 ordinary men had held back an entire battalion. But their fight wasn't over. Not by a long shot. 1,124 hours. The bridge had been silent for 37 minutes. It was the kind of silence that screams. The kind that crawls under your skin and makes every second feel like an hour. Drabic kept the wires raised, his arms burning with fatigue, while the Germans maintained their distance and discussed their options. But everyone knew the standoff couldn't last forever. "Sarge," Delizio called softly from his position. "We've got movement. Western bank, behind us." Drabic's heart leapt. Reinforcements. Finally, he risked a glance backward, and his hope died. It wasn't reinforcements. It was a single jeep, racing toward the bridge at breakneck speed, swerving around shell craters. As it skidded to a stop, a captain jumped out, Captain James Hartley from Battalion Intelligence. "Sergeant!" Hartley shouted, sprinting toward their position in a crouch. "Sergeant Drabic!" "Stay down!" Drabic yelled. But Hartley was already there, sliding into cover beside him, breathing hard. "Where's the rest of your company?" Hartley demanded. "This is it, sir. 9 men. Hartley stared at him. 9? Intelligence reported at least a platoon holding this bridge. They said. He stopped, understanding dawning. "Jesus Christ. It's been you? Just you 9? This whole time?" "Yes, sir. The Germans have been regrouping for a major assault. We intercepted radio traffic. They're bringing up everything. They have at least 300 men, maybe more. They've been calling in units from up and down the river." Hartley grabbed Drabic's shoulder. "Son, you need to fall back. Now. You've done enough. More than enough." "What about the bridge, sir? We'll blow it ourselves if we have to. But you 9 aren't dying here for..." "Sir." Drabic's voice was quiet but firm. "If we fall back, the Germans take the bridge in 5 minutes. If they take it, they'll fortify it. Then you'll need to fight across it under fire, and hundreds of our boys will die. If we stay, even for another hour, that's 1 more hour for our forces to organize a proper assault to relieve us. You won't last another hour. Then we'll last as long as we can." Hartley looked at the 9 men. These exhausted, filthy, ammunition-starved soldiers who'd been holding an impossible position through sheer audacity and desperation. He saw something in their faces, not resignation, but a kind of grim determination that made him understand why the Germans had been held back so long. "I can't order you to stay," Hartley said finally. "That would be murder." "You're not ordering us, sir," Drabic replied. "We're choosing." Hartley nodded slowly. "Reinforcements are coming. 30 minutes. Maybe 45. Can you hold that long?" Drabic looked at his men. 9 hands, 9 sets of eyes that had seen too much, 9 lives that could end in the next hour. "We'll hold," Burroughs said, speaking for all of them. Hartley pulled out his pistol and handed it to Drabic along with 2 spare magazines. "Then God be with you, Sergeant." As the jeep raced away, Delizio laughed a slightly unhinged sound. 30 minutes. That's funny. We've got maybe 20 rounds between all of us. Then we'll make them count. Drabic said. At 1,147 hours, the Germans came with everything. No probes, no careful tactics, just a massive wave of men surging across the bridge like a tide of gray uniforms and steel. They'd made their calculation. 9 Americans couldn't possibly have enough ammunition left to stop 300. They were right. The Americans opened fire, but it was pitiful compared to the earlier engagements. A few shots, then silence as someone ran dry. A few more shots, another silence. "Conserve! Conserve!" Drabic shouted. But there was nothing left to conserve. The Germans kept coming. 50 feet away. 40. Delizio fired his last BAR round, then threw the empty weapon aside. "I'm out. Out," Priester echoed. "Out. Out." The chorus of doom spread across the American positions. 9 rifles going silent one by one. Drabic fired his last 3 rounds, crack, 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 and watched 2 Germans fall. Then his bolt locked back on an empty chamber. The Germans were 30 feet away and closing. "Fix bayonets!" Drabic screamed. It was an order from another century, from an era before machine guns and modern warfare. But it was all they had left. 9 men drew their bayonets, those long, wicked blades designed for a kind of warfare that was supposed to be obsolete. They were about to learn it wasn't obsolete at all. The first German to reach their position was a young soldier, no older than Burroughs. He came around a piece of wreckage with his rifle raised, and Burroughs buried his bayonet in the man's chest. The German's eyes went wide with shock and pain. He made a sound, not a scream, but a wet, choking gasp, and collapsed. Burroughs stared at his bloodied bayonet in horror. He'd killed men before, but always at distance, always through a scope or across open ground. This was different. This was feeling the resistance of flesh, hearing the death rattle, seeing the light fade from another human being's eyes at arm's length. He vomited, but he raised his rifle again, because the Germans were still coming. What happened next was chaos. Brutal, intimate, terrible chaos. Delizio, the boxer, swung his rifle like a club, the wooden stock connecting with a German's jaw with a crack that echoed off the metal supports. The man went down, and Delizio kept swinging, kept moving, kept fighting with the same intensity he'd once brought to the ring, except now the stakes weren't pride or prize money, but survival. Priester fought with his bayonet, reciting prayers between thrusts. "Forgive me, Father Thrust, for I have sinned. Parry, and I shall sin again." Another German fell. Drabic found himself grappling with a German officer, both of them having lost their weapons. They crashed into the bridge railing, trading blows, grunting and cursing in 2 different languages that both meant the same thing: survival at any cost. The officer got his hands around Drabic's throat. Squeezed. Drabic's vision started to tunnel, going dark at the edges. His lungs burned. This was it. This was how it ended. He remembered the pistol. Hartley's pistol. His hand scrabbled for it, found the grip, yanked it free. He pressed it against the German's ribs and pulled the trigger. The man's eyes widened. His grip loosened. He slid away, leaving Drabic gasping and coughing on the bridge surface. Around him, his men were still fighting, still somehow holding, but they were being pushed back, step by step. There were too many Germans, too many. At 1,203 hours, something impossible happened. The German assault suddenly faltered. Not because of the Americans they were on the verge of being overrun, but because of something else. A sound, a deep rumbling thunder that wasn't artillery. Tanks, American tanks, appearing on the western bank like steel cavalry, and behind them, infantry, hundreds of infantry. The reinforcements had arrived early, drawn by the sound of combat and the desperate reports from Captain Hartley. The Germans heard it too, felt the vibration through the bridge structure, and suddenly their 300-man assault was about to be caught between 9 desperate Americans on the bridge and an armored column on the western bank. The German officers screamed orders. "Retreat! Fall back! Get off the bridge! The wave reversed. Gray uniforms suddenly flooding back toward the eastern bank in a panic that bordered on rout. Drabic, still on his knees, bloodied and gasping, watched them go. He wanted to feel triumph. Victory. Something. All he felt was exhausted. The American tanks rolled onto the bridge at 1,207 hours. Infantry followed, spreading out, securing positions. A lieutenant ran up to Drabic's position, took one look at the 9 Americans, and stopped dead. "My God," he breathed. "What happened here?" Drabic looked at his men. Burroughs was sitting with his back against a support beam, staring at nothing. Delicio was checking himself for wounds he hadn't noticed in the fight. Priester was praying again, his hands shaking violently. They were covered in blood, their own and others. Their uniforms were torn. Their faces were masks of cordite and exhaustion. Empty weapons and brass casings littered the ground around them. "We held," Drabic said simply. The lieutenant looked around at the evidence of the battle. The German bodies, the improvised defenses, the signs of a desperate, impossible stand. "How many of you were there?" "9. How many Germans?" "We stopped counting at 200. The lieutenant shook his head in disbelief. "You 9 held off an entire battalion? For over 3 hours?" "We had motivation," Delicio croaked, his voice raw. "We didn't want to die." "What you did here," the lieutenant started, but stopped, because there weren't really words for it. A medic arrived, started checking them over. Minor wounds mostly. Burroughs had a concussion from the grenade earlier. Delicio had fractured 2 fingers. Priester had taken shrapnel in his leg and hadn't even noticed. But they were alive, all 9 of them. Against every odd, against every calculation, they were alive. As they were being evacuated off the bridge, Captain Hartley returned. He walked among them, looking at each man's face before turning to Drabic. "I need to tell you something," Hartley said quietly, pulling Drabic aside. "Something you need to know about this bridge." "Sir? That German battalion you fought? They weren't trying to retake the bridge for a counteroffensive." Drabic frowned. "Then why?" "They were trying to destroy it. The German High Command issued orders 3 hours ago. That bridge cannot be allowed to stand. It's too strategically valuable." They were willing to sacrifice an entire battalion to either capture it so they could blow it properly or to die trying. "I don't understand," Drabic said slowly. "Those men you fought? They were on a suicide mission. They knew they probably wouldn't survive. They were ordered to take that bridge at all costs." Hartley paused. "And you 9 stopped them. You didn't just hold a position, Sergeant. You stopped what could have been the largest German demolition operation of the entire war." Drabic looked back at the bridge, at the twisted metal and damaged surface, at the place where 9 ordinary men had done something extraordinary. "We didn't know," he said quietly. "Would it have changed anything if you had?" Drabic thought about that. About the choice to stand when they could have retreated. About fighting on when ammunition ran out. About the moment when survival seemed impossible, but they fought anyway. "No," he said finally. "No, it wouldn't have." But the story wasn't over. Not quite. As American engineers began securing the bridge, one of them made a discovery that turned everyone's blood cold. The German demolition charges the ones Drabic had bluffed with. The ones they'd wired to the dead radio battery weren't actually disconnected from their power source. They were live. The German detonator had failed, yes, but it had failed in a partially armed state. All it would have taken was a strong vibration, a direct hit from a mortar, or someone connecting wires to complete a circuit. The engineering officer pulled Drabic aside, his face pale. "Sergeant, do you understand what I'm telling you? When you held up those wires, when you threatened to connect them, that wasn't a bluff. That was real. If you'd actually touched those wires together, you would have blown this bridge into the Rhine, with all of you on it." Drabic stared at the wires in his hand, the wires he'd held for over 30 minutes. The wires he'd almost connected half a dozen times when his arms got tired. "But we didn't know," he said. "Ignorance saved your life," the engineer said. "If you'd known it was real, you might have hesitated, might have made a mistake, but you thought it was fake, so you handled it casually." "Jesus," Burroughs whispered, having overheard. "We almost killed ourselves." But Drabick was thinking about something else. About the choice they'd made. About standing when retreat was possible. About fighting when surrender was logical. "We made our choice," he said finally. "The bridge or us. We chose the bridge. Even if it meant dying." Drabick looked at his 8 men. His brothers. The ones who'd stood with him on that impossible day. "Especially if it meant dying," he said. "That's what makes it worth something." March 7th, 1945 became a date that changed the war. Within 72 hours of the bridge's capture, over 8,000 American troops had crossed the Rhine. Within a week, 25,000. The German defensive line, the one Hitler had sworn would never be breached, had been shattered by 9 men who refused to retreat. But the story of what happened on that bridge, that stayed classified for months. The reason was simple and brutal. The U.S. Army didn't want the enemy to know how close they'd come to losing everything. How 9 men, nearly out of ammunition, had held back a battalion through deception, desperation, and sheer audacity. If the Germans had known the truth, that one more push, one more assault, might have overwhelmed those 9 defenders, it could have emboldened resistance elsewhere. So the official reports were sanitized. American forces secured the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen against determined enemy resistance. No mention of the numbers. No mention of the impossible odds. The 9 men were quietly awarded Bronze Stars in a ceremony that took place in a muddy field behind the lines. No press, no fanfare. Just a colonel pinning medals on dirty uniforms and saying, "Your country thanks you for your service." Then they were sent back to their units. Back to the war, as if nothing extraordinary had happened at all. Sergeant Alex Drabick rotated home in July 1945. He returned to Ohio, to his wife and his newborn daughter, a girl he'd never met, born while he was holding that bridge. People would ask him about the war. "What did you do? Where did you serve?" "I was at Remagen," he'd say. "Oh, the bridge. That was something, wasn't it? Must have been quite a sight seeing all those troops cross." "Yeah," he'd say. "Quite a sight." He never told them about the 3 hours, about the 9 men, about the moment his rifle ran dry and he fixed his bayonet against impossible odds. Who would believe it anyway? He got a job at a factory, raised his daughter, mowed his lawn on Saturdays, became, to all outward appearances, just another veteran trying to forget what he'd seen and done in a war that felt increasingly distant. But sometimes, late at night, his wife would wake to find him standing at the window, staring out at nothing. "Alex," she'd whisper, "are you okay?" "Fine," he'd say, just remembering. What he never told her, what he never told anyone, was that he was counting. Still counting. Counting the rounds he'd fired. Counting the Germans who'd fallen. Counting the impossible seconds that had somehow added up to survival. The math still didn't work. It never would. Private Jim Burroughs came home different. His mother knew it the moment she saw him at the train station. This wasn't the boy who'd lied about his age to enlist. This was someone older, someone who'd seen things that aged you in ways that had nothing to do with years. He tried college on the GI Bill. Lasted 1 semester. The other students complained about exams and dates and football games. And Burroughs would sit there thinking, "I killed a man with a bayonet. I felt his blood on my hands. How am I supposed to care about a history quiz?" He dropped out, drifted for a while. Odd jobs, long silences. It was 1953 before he finally found a veterans group where people understood, where you didn't have to explain why loud noises made you flinch, where the nightmares were normal, where the math of 9 versus 200 wasn't impossible. It was just what happened when you had no choice. but to stand. "I was at Remagen," he told another veteran once. "The bridge." "Yeah? Which division?" "I was one of the 9. The other man looked at him sharply. "The 9? The ones who held it at the start? Jesus Christ. I thought that was a legend." "It was real," Burroughs said quietly. "We were real." Corporal Joseph DeLizio, the boxer from Brooklyn, never fought again after the war. People who knew him before said the speed was still there, the reflexes, the raw power. But something else was gone. The aggression, the will to hurt another human being, even in a controlled environment. "I used enough violence for one lifetime," he'd say when people asked why he didn't return to the ring. He became a trainer instead. Worked with kids in a Brooklyn gym, teaching them to defend themselves, to be strong, to be brave. Sometimes, watching a young fighter in the ring, he'd remember the bridge. Remember fighting hand-to-hand against men who were just trying to survive, same as him. Remember the terrible intimacy of combat at arm's length. One of his students once asked, "Coach, were you scared? In the war?" DeLizio thought about that for a long time before answering. "Every second," he said finally. "But being scared doesn't mean you quit. It means you're paying attention. It means you understand what you're risking. And sometimes, you risk it anyway. Why? Because some things are worth standing for, even when you're terrified. Especially when you're terrified." Private First Class Marion Priester returned to seminary after the war. His path to ministry had been interrupted by combat, and many assumed he'd abandoned it entirely after what he'd experienced. You can't kill men with a bayonet and still believe in God, can you? But Priester had a different perspective. "I saw the worst of what humans can do to each other," he said in his first sermon as an ordained minister. "I participated in it. I have blood on my hands that no confession will ever fully wash away. But I also saw 9 men choose to stand for something bigger than themselves. I saw courage in the face of certain death. I saw brotherhood that transcended self-preservation." He paused, looking out at his congregation. If that's not proof of the divine spark in humanity, that capacity to choose sacrifice over survival, then I don't know what is. God wasn't on that bridge. We were. And we had to make godly choices with mortal hearts. His church became known for its work with veterans, for understanding that faith and trauma could coexist, that you could carry both the weight of what you'd done and the hope of redemption. And once a year, on March 7th, he'd light a candle, 9 candles actually, one for each man who'd stood on that bridge. Some of them were still alive, some weren't, but all of them had made a choice that mattered. The full story of the 9 didn't emerge until 1958, when a military historian doing research on the Rhine crossing stumbled across the classified after-action reports. He interviewed the survivors, pieced together what had happened, and published an article in a military history journal. Nobody noticed. It wasn't until 1967 that a documentary filmmaker, a veteran himself, read that article and decided to track down the 9 men. By then, 2 had died. But he found the other 7, interviewed them, captured their stories. The documentary aired once, late at night, on a small network. Still, nobody noticed. It's a strange thing about history. We remember the big moments, the invasions, the battles, the turning points, but we forget the small moments that made those big moments possible. We forget the 9 men who held a bridge, the individual acts of courage that, added together, changed everything. Drabic died in 1993. His obituary mentioned he was a veteran. It mentioned he'd received a Bronze Star. It didn't mention the bridge. By the time historians fully recognized the significance of what had happened, that 9 men had held a strategic position against a battalion, buying critical hours that changed the entire Rhine crossing operation, most of the 9 were gone. The last survivor, Private James Burroughs, died in 2003 at age 77. At his funeral, an Army colonel presented his family with a flag and said, "Your father was a hero." His daughter, who'd heard her father's stories about the bridge since she was a child, said, "I know, but I don't think he ever felt like one." The colonel smiled sadly. "That's what makes them heroes. The ones who feel it don't understand what it means. The ones who did it just remember being scared. So why does this story matter? Why should we remember 9 men on a bridge in 1945? Because it reminds us of something essential about human nature, something we risk forgetting in an age of precision, weapons and drone strikes, and combat that happens at a distance. It reminds us that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's choosing to act despite it. It reminds us that ordinary people, faced with impossible situations, are capable of extraordinary things. It reminds us that the choices we make in moments of crisis define us more than the comfortable choices we make in times of peace. 9 men stood on a bridge. They had every reason to retreat, every logical justification for withdrawal. The math said they'd die if they stayed. They stayed anyway. Not because they were fearless, not because they were superhuman, but because something in that moment demanded more than logic. It demanded sacrifice. It demanded that someone stand when standing seemed impossible. And they chose to be that someone. The Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen collapsed 10 days after its capture. Weakened by the earlier German demolition attempts and the constant heavy traffic crossing it. 28 American engineers died in the collapse, working to repair and maintain the structure. But by then, the Allies had built pontoon bridges across the Rhine. The breakthrough had been achieved. The war in Europe had 4 more weeks to run. And somewhere in those 4 weeks, the momentum created by the Remagen crossing, the momentum created by 9 men buying 3 hours, helped bring the conflict to its end. They never saw it that way, of course. The 9 men who survived always downplayed what they'd done. "We just did our job," they'd say. Anyone would have done the same. "We got lucky, that's all." But here's the truth. They were too humble to speak. Not anyone would have done the same. Most wouldn't have. Most would have made the logical choice, the safe choice, the choice that prioritized survival over mission. And they weren't lucky. They were skilled, desperate, creative, and brave beyond measure. They were 9 ordinary men who, for 3 hours on a cold March morning, became exactly what their moment in history required them to be. Heroes who never quite believed they deserved the word. Today, there's a small memorial at the site where the Ludendorff Bridge once stood. It mentions the bridge's capture. It mentions its strategic importance. It mentions the Allied forces who crossed there. If you look carefully, there's a small plaque added in 2015, 70 years after the battle. It reads, "In memory of the 9 American soldiers who held this bridge on the 7th of March 1945, against overwhelming odds, their names deserve to be remembered. Sergeant Alex Drabick, Private James Burrows, Corporal Joseph DeLizio, Private First Class, Marion Priester, Private Anthony Semelli, Private Joseph Petrenchik, Private Michael Chinchar, Private Eugene Dorland, Private Marvin Jensen." 9 men, 3 hours, 1 choice that changed everything. Most people walk past it without stopping, but every so often, someone pauses, reads the names, does the math in their head, 9 men against a battalion, and whispers, "How is that even possible?" And maybe that's the point. Maybe the value of impossible stories isn't that they're easy to believe, but that they remind us what's possible when ordinary people refuse to accept what's logical. The 9 men at Remagen didn't hold that bridge because they thought they could win. They held it because someone had to. And in that moment, they decided that someone would be them. That's not just history. That's a lesson. The bridge is gone. The war is long over. The men who stood there are gone too. But the choice they made echoes forward through time. Every time someone stands when retreat is logical. Every time someone fights when surrender is reasonable. Every time someone chooses principle over survival. Mission over safety. Others over self. The 9 men are standing on that bridge again, making the math impossible, defying the odds, reminding us that sometimes, just sometimes, 9 can hold against 200 if they're willing to stand.